Okay, it is 6 o'clock, so we're going to start this evening with our Truth in Taxation hearing. Lori?
I know it. Oh my gosh. Hanging on my every word. Okay, state law requires us to have a public meeting on our school levy, and so that's what we are doing tonight. We review the current year budget, some prior year actual revenue expenses, and the tax levy that's proposed, and like the tax impact of that is also data we review. Okay, so this kind of summarizes what I just talked about, but it is regarding, the Truth in Taxation hearing is regarding the school taxes for 2017 payable in 2018. It's a little interesting tidbit on Minnesota. Public education is strong. I mean, it's nice to see that Minnesota has the highest score among 17 states where every eligible student takes the exam. And our average composite score in Minnesota for the ACT is 21.5. The Minnesota Constitution clarifies the uniform system for public schools, and it's the duty of the legislature to establish a general and uniform system of public schools. School funding is highly regulated by the state, and formulas are determined by the legislature. And through those formulas, they determine what piece or portion of that formula is a state aid versus a local levy. And so most of our levy is predetermined by the legislature of what the local taxpayer share is. And for the education formula, a big challenge that we have in Minnesota is that it has not kept pace with inflation. I mentioned this year after year in this presentation because it is lagging behind inflation. For example, even though we did get an increase in our funding formula for the Gen Ed formula for the 17-18 year and for the 18-19 year, it would need to increase by another 9.4% in order to keep pace with inflation since the 2002-3 year. This graph just shows how we have lagged behind, that the funding formula is not keeping up with inflation, and it definitely brings a challenge for school districts due to that fact. Another challenging piece on our funding is special education, and the stats show now that it's an average of 40% underfunded based on how the program formulas work, show how the state should be funding it, but they prorate it, and so we are not fully funded in that category of special ed either. So those two things of the Gen Ed formula falling behind inflation and special ed not being fully funded are two huge challenges for public schools. And due to that, districts have operating referendums to help with their funding. And 65% of districts have an operating referendum, averaging 332 per pupil in '93, and that has certainly gone up over the years. The average levy authority for referendums is $12.96 per pupil. And I want to point out that of that amount, they do have a tax relief portion of the operating referendum throughout the state, and it's called local optional revenue of $417. So that does help give tax relief to those districts that are able to pass an operating referendum, and that applies to our situation as well.
Lori, go back a slide, or Lori. Notice it says all Minnesota school districts. I think it's the first time I've seen that have a referendum now, or local optional referendum. So that is an increase.
Yep.
Used to be most.
Right.
So that just tells you right there that the state is not keeping up, and all the districts are compelled to do that.
All right. As I mentioned, before, the funding formulas are determined by the state, and the tax levy does not necessarily determine a change in budget. Your expenditure budget is pretty much set by, well, the bulk of our budget in the general fund is set by our staffing. And because we're a service organization. Now, we do have components of our budget that the board does approve, based on a dollar amount that's part of a formula, and long-term facility maintenance is one of those. And that is basically what we discussed at our proposed levy back in September. But just to clarify that the school levy amount does not necessarily correlate to an equal increase in a budget or change in budget. It's just a component of the funding formula. One thing that I just like to point out that the school district, our fiscal year is in a different alignment than county and city. County and city are on a calendar year budget, and our fiscal year begins on July 1st and goes through June 30th. So we are a little bit on a different timeline than the other two public entities. Our district funds are laid out on this chart, and of course it aligns with a budget proposals I've brought to the board in the past. Those are our main funds. This chart here, you may have noticed, was published in the Oberly Tribune, our official newspaper. It's a requirement where we publish what the audited figures are for not only fund balance, revenues and expenses of the last fiscal year, 16-17. We will have our audit presented tonight as well. So the June 30th, 2017 fund balance is a final number. And then the 17-18 budgets is listed on the right side of this chart. On revenues and expense, that's based on the original budget that you approved in June for this year. And just want to point out that we're working on an amendment right now of our budget, and I will be bringing that to the board January or February to amend that would show like our final federal grants that were awarded, and there's a number of things that we'll be tweaking. We'll have actual settlement amounts. In the original budget, I put in estimates for settlement, things like that, and our amended budget that I bring in January, February also reflect the final staffing, as we did add some staff due to class sizes at certain grade levels this fall as the school year started. This chart just lays out for the new year just an illustration of our revenue, of the different funds and how they line up comparatively. Of course, the general fund is our largest fund. Obviously, that's where our main operations are expended. And it's a $46 million revenue budget, which is 86% of the grand total of all our revenues. And then the various other funds are laid out there. Food service and community service funds are considered operating funds as well. So you have your general fund, food service, and community service. Those three together are considered your operating funds. And so sometimes we report data in that fashion, showing those in a cluster. The expenditure budget for the new year, the general fund revenue. This breaks it down just for the general fund only. This illustrates that the state of Minnesota funds 85% of our revenues. So, and again, that comes through formulas. It's based, the bulk of our funding is based on the number of students we serve. So that's something we track closely as our enrollments. And local property tax, what we're discussing tonight, is overall quite small percentage of our grand total revenue for the general fund, which is 9.4% of our total general fund budget. Okay, expenditures for the general fund. by program area and this reflects our New Year's budget of 45.7 million. And instructional categories are largest expenditure or planned expenditure, where you have regular ed at 42% and special ed at 24.9%. And then also you have vocational instruction at 1.4%. Those three pieces are your main instructional expenses, and that's very typical because we are a service organization. And that's what we're about, is educating students. Taking a look at our general fund expenditure budget for the new year by what's called object code, like type of expense. So this is another way of looking at the data. Salaries and wages, this would be salaries of all our general fund employees, from teachers to paraprofessionals to custodians, etc. That's 58%. And employee benefits such as health insurance, Social Security, TRA or PRA, and those types of benefits is 23%. So that's very typical. These percentages, other districts will be very similar to us in those areas. Then we get to determination of the levy. And I'm just going to cruise through. This is what a notice of property taxes, proposed taxes looks like. And that's what property owners would have received by now, is this notice. This is just a sample form here. School district taxes. I mentioned levy limits. There are state law determines some of these levy limits, and of course some categories are voter approved. So like, for example, our operating referendum was a voter approved levy, and some of our debt schedules, as our high school building bonds drop off, as for example, the high school building bond, the last year of the payment is this year. So on these taxes, no longer reflects that bond payment for the high school. And so some of the other debt schedules come into play that were not necessarily voter approved. The OPEB bonds were one, and then another one would be the HVAC upgrade, where it was QZAP bonds and all facility bonds. So just to kind of clarify, there's different categories in the levy. This just shows a flow chart of timing and how the legislature basically sets the formulas, the data comes down the county auditor, and in the end, we're now on the yellow step 6. So tonight is where the school board had approved the proposed levy in September, and now we're at the public hearing, and tonight the board will be considering approving the final levy here in December. And we mentioned about the proposed property tax statements. Those were sent out by the county auditor mid-November. Tonight is our Truth and Taxation hearing. Okay, and in our levy tonight, the proposed payable 2018 levy reflects an increase of $400,000 or 5.11%. So that's exactly what was approved in September at our proposed property tax levy. This is a breakdown of that levy. So these numbers you've seen months before in September. Basically, the main driver of the $400,000 increase in the levy is the LTFM, long-term facility maintenance funding. There are a variety of variables back and forth, but that's kind of the main amount that sticks out. And I mentioned voter-approved debt service, and you'll see that negative $2.7 million. That is reflective that those high school building bonds will be paid off this year, therefore are not on next year's levy. But then the debts schedule drops into the category of basically the OPEB bonds, and so now that's the category of debt that is in line for the cycle of payments for the upcoming 18-19 year. So that's just why you'll see those kind of an in and an out. It's a movement of a category.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So the other post-employment benefits go from 310,000 to 2.3 million.
Right.
Can you explain that?
Sure. So in the past, for the other post-employment benefits, that's our OPEB bonds. So up to this point, we've been paying interest only. So now we're going to be starting to pay the principal along with interest on those bonds. That's how the debt schedules were aligned. The reason they did this, and these OPEB bonds were sold probably back in 2008-ish. It was before I was here, before Mike was here. It's a really good thing the district did because that is funding the health insurance for retired teachers or retired staff that were eligible for it. So, for example, that $2 million debt payment, that OPEB trust, we have the balance in there off the top of my head is, well, it's more than $5 million. And so the good news is we have that funding stream to pay for these retiree benefits for quite a few years yet. And so it just happens to be that now we'll start paying those bond payments off. And those bond payments will be paid off in about 3 years. Then the OPEB bonds drop off. It's about 3 years. Any other questions? All right, so this is just a summary of some of the changes. So one area that of the levy that went up, and that was voter-approved operating referendum. It was an increase of 148,000, and that's due to two reasons. There is an inflationary adjustment on our referendum. That's the way our operating referendum was approved, that it included an inflationary increase. And there was also a projected enrollment increase. And you'll see that later tonight in the audit report. You can visually see how our enrollment has been increasing over the last 5 years, and we're still projecting a very slight increase. So it does impact the levy in that way. Then the biggest item of change in our taxes, is the long-term facility maintenance, and that category is increasing by $408,000. And the reason for that is that this new revenue stream is being phased in over 3 years. And so this is really the first year you see this much of a jump. So that is the reason for it. And it is, I need to stress, this is such an important funding stream. I know my MASBO group, my state association, we've been bringing this topic to the legislature for many years because districts did not have enough funds available to maintain and repair their buildings, including parking lots. And is due to many, many discussions with the legislature that this LTFM funding did get updated and included. So for us, for our district, that's a big reason why we're able to do the high school parking lot this year. So we finally had enough funds to do that project. And we'll continue to do important projects as this funding stream comes into play. Then another a question earlier about debt service, and the voter approved category went down by 2.7 million. And the reason for change, as I mentioned, is that the high school building bonds will be paid off February 1 of 2018. Then the other category of debt service that was going up kind of by a similar amount in a way is debt service for facility maintenance and other post-employment benefits. So we have a combination of the OPEB principal and interest coming into play, as well as principal for some of the old facility bonds. And then there is a reduction of $140,000 for a category called reduction for debt excess. And what this is all about is that the state regulations, I mean, it's all preset in the calculations that they have districts have their levy for any debt at 105% of principal and interest, because they want to make sure the districts have the funds available in case there's, if some taxpayers are delinquent in their taxes, in the payment of their tax. We have to make sure we have the funds to cover our debt payments. So as time goes on, if we're collecting our levies as we should, then we end up getting a little bit too much in what's called this, the cushion for the debt excess. And so in this case, we now have reached kind of above this threshold of the 5%, and so they're scaling us back a little bit to get us in realignment. It's just a standard thing. They recalc it every year. Okay, so there may be a variety of things causing a tax bill to increase or decrease from year to year, of course. That there can be changes of valuation in the individual property, and then there can be a change in the total value of all property in the district, so how our tax, how the school tax is spread amongst the tax base, that can be a factor, and then, of course, what the school levy is. And in our case, the proposed levy was 5.11% increase. I'm just going to continue to flip through a couple of these here. This chart here is what is, I think, of great interest. On the far right, you'll see in yellow an explanation of the change in taxes from the 2017 tax year to the 2018 tax year. And it's broken down by types of property. A category we commonly use as this kind of an average value of a home in Oberly is $100,000. So a residential homestead of $100,000 market value of a home. On the far right, you'll see with this, our levy proposal for school tax will increase $25 for that property owner with this levy proposal. So basically, you can see in the various areas of commercial industrial. One thing I do want to mention is that I talked a little bit about the ag credit that will help the farmers with any of the levies that have to do with debt service. Now, the ag credit only applies to a type of debt that's not an OPEB. So like our OPEB levy that's now kicking in for the principal, ag credit does not get applied to OPEB bonds. So as time goes on, though, our farmers will feel that ag credit coming into a system, especially once that OPEB bond, in 3 years when those OPEB bonds drop off, then they'll feel that credit helping them more, that ag credit. So basically, that's what I have. The rest is kind of informational. Any questions?
Lori, is that, I'm assuming a PowerPoint presentation you just presented, is that, can that be made available to us?
Absolutely. Because
you may find this hard to believe, but I did not succeed in digesting all of it thoroughly. And it would be nice to be able to go over that, especially if someone calls and has questions about the levy.
Yep, we can have Ashley email that out. It has a lot of really good information. Actually, we have Ehlers Financial Advisors. They calculate the tax impact and all that, so they have a lot of good data in that PowerPoint.
Any other questions? Okay, I guess we can move on to our regular meetings, so would you please rise and join me for the pledge of the flag? Okay, our next agenda item is approval of tonight's agenda. Is there a motion to do so? Okay, is there a second?
Second.
Okay, motion's been made and second. All those in favor of approving tonight's agenda signify by saying aye. Aye. Pose same sign. Motion carries. Okay, Lori, I guess you're the study session also, so is there any additional comments or?
Regarding the levy? Or is this the audit? Okay, I'm sorry, I don't have the agenda right in front of me. Okay, so yes, for the audit, we're gonna have our auditor, Greg Larson, come and present the audit summary. And Greg already met with the Board Finance Committee and gave a very detailed explanation of the audit report. We have good news, the financials came out very good. And, but I'll have Greg present information on a PowerPoint that simplifies and summarizes the information.
Yep, this is a lot. Real brief here, so we'll go through the numbers. It was a good year for the district. The fund balances, as you see when we go through this, will show that pretty much all your funds across the board in the district held their own or slightly improved. Page 7 is a detailed analysis of your general fund. If you look at the lower right-hand corner, it shows that the fund balance as of June of 16 of the general fund was $6,920,000. Just above it, it shows for the general fund, you took in $119,000 more than what you spent. So you ended up with total general fund balance $7,039,557. The first column on the left side would be the unrestricted, but this includes some unassigned and some non-spendable funds. So basically that went down slightly, $36,000. Non-capital restrictions, they improved by $19,000. The operating capital, a year ago, your operating capital reserve was almost at zero. It's ended up with $134,349. Health and safety is something that's going away. That has a small plus number there. Long-time facilities maintenance, this is the newer one here. So that is just getting started. And then again shows totals, again, that your general fund held its own and improved slightly. We'll go on to the next page. This shows the unassigned fund all by itself. So you can see that unassigned fund balance is pretty much has a nice positive trend. Not always able to do this, but you are able to do it here in this district, which is a nice thing. You have a nice fund balance. There'll be some more information on this as we go through here. The next one we have is on the operating capital fund balance, and you can see what happened there the last couple of years. You had spent down, and this year you did get some money back in the operating capital fund, so you can actually do some things again. Page 9 is your food service fund balance, and so that one's held its own. There's a small improvement in that fund balance. And then we have the community service fund. It shows an improvement there. You had spent down a little bit in 16, but this year it came back up again. And the debt service fund, here you can see that fund balance did improve this year. And when you went through the levy information, Lori pointed out that the state of Minnesota has a cap there. It says if you have a little bit more than what they think, then they'll reduce your levy for future debt payments, and that's actually a good thing for your taxpayers because your taxpayers have paid in more than what they allowed for that 5% allowance that Lori mentioned. So actually the taxpayers get a small break on their debt levy. And then the next slide we'll have would be on your ADM numbers, and Lori mentioned that this has been a nice trend the last 4 years. Your ADM numbers have actually gone up. prior to this period, I think you'd had some declines over a period of time, and the way the state of Minnesota funds you, everything is pretty much generated by your student numbers. So this is a positive thing here. The next graph I have is pretty similar to what Lori had in her truth and taxation slides, and I thought it was pretty interesting because the numbers are very comparable. The numbers don't change much from year to year. This is general fund revenues, and this shows for this past year, your state source revenue is 84.49% of your total revenue for the general fund. And as Lori mentioned out, the state aid revenue has not kept up with inflation. Tom Melcher does a lot of work at the state of Minnesota. He's one of the people that really knows what's going on, and he's pointed that out at different workshops over the years. And that's why you need those other pieces. The second biggest piece is your property tax revenue is 9%. So again, not a big piece of the pie, but it is there. And then you have federal source revenue, 3.81, and then the other revenue, so 2.7. So the big piece is your state aid revenue. And then we have broken down some of the different categories where you're spending your money so you can see how you compare year by year. And then this one, we've added some numbers for 16. So take into account when we're looking at those last two columns, we're comparing 2016 numbers for other districts to your 2016. We have a 2017 column because your district has 2017 numbers. The state of Minnesota does not have statewide numbers yet for 17 on the other districts. So we're comparing 16 for all districts on that light blue column there, and then the last column would be for districts that are similar size to your district here. So you can see that your costs are a little bit higher in this area than in some other districts. Special education would be on the next one. Well, I skipped over a page, I'm sorry. Regular instruction. And we have a couple things we want to point out. We pointed it out to the Finance Committee. So if you look at 2016 numbers compared to your 2016 numbers, you're right in line. They're a little bit less than the statewide numbers. 2017, we have 5,531 per student there, so it's up quite a bit. One of the things that I pointed out to the Finance Committee is there was a new entry that was made this year, right at the end of the year, to record your share of state aid revenue for PERA and TRA pensions. They required us to the district to make an entry to add $1.2 million to your revenues and $1.2 million to your expenses, and it went in the regular instruction area. So you added $1.2 million for your share of PERA and TRA pension costs, which has never been done before. So you can see what part of that big jump is because of that entry. And so it'll be interesting to see the statewide numbers next year to see how you're in line with that if the other districts made that entry. The next piece would be vocational instruction here. And again, comparing 2016 numbers statewide and similar sized districts, you're right in line. This year your vocational costs were up some from the year before at your local district here. And the page that would be the next one would be the special ed one that we need to look at. And Lori Volz and I have looked at this in past years, and your district historically has been higher than the state average in your special ed cost. Your special services director was at our Finance Committee meeting, and Lori and her mentioned that you do have a higher percentage of special ed students being served compared to other districts in the state of Minnesota, which would mean your cost per student would be higher. It is a huge difference, yeah. And so this year, your cost overall per student was down. Your student numbers were up, but your number of special ed students were down in 2016-17 from the year before. So you're still spending a similar number per special ed student. You just had less special ed students this past fiscal year, but your special services director mentioned that the special services or the special ed student count is back up again for this coming year from what you can see. So that is a big cost there. The instructional support services here, your district has run higher than other districts. In reviewing that, Lori mentioned that you've had a lot of additional costs for technology equipment, and that would show up in this area. The next area is sites, buildings, equipment, and other. So again, your district has been a little bit lower than the statewide average, and for districts of similar size. Here, the next area would be pupil support services, not counting your transportation costs. So in this area, you're under what other districts are spending in this area.
What's included in that area?
We talked about that. Lori mentioned that would be psychologists and
Yeah, basically psychologists that I can think of off the top of my head. Most of the expenses in that category is transportation, but he has that in a separate graph, the transportation piece.
Page 15, the next scale would be transportation costs. So again, comparing 16 to 16 numbers, you're right in the ballpark there. And you have contracted services. Sometimes when you have contracted services, the costs run higher than the statewide averages, but you're right in line with those numbers. And actually for 16, you're lower than the other number for statewide schools and right in the ballpark for districts of your size. So I know your neighboring district, Austin, doesn't have as big a rural area, so their transportation costs would be lower too, but you have a pretty good size rural area here that you do serve, so this is nice to be in line there. Food service would be the next slide. Again, if you compare 16 numbers to 16 for your district, you're pretty much right in the ballpark. There, your costs were higher this year. Again, we're looking at 17. 16 numbers compare very favorable to the other districts in the state of Minnesota. And page 16, this next one would be on the debt service here. So this is showing that you're under what the statewide average is for your debt costs, and you're under what the districts of similar size are showing. And Lori mentioned that your building bond payment, it's got one final payment, and your OPEB has 3 more years. You're getting rid of a lot of debt in the next 4 years here, so that'll be nice.
We'll work on balancing that out.
Yeah, but overall, the district did have a good year. They had a clean audit opinion. I do appreciate the staff here working with us on the audit, but yeah, you did have a good year here. Unless there are any questions, I went through that very quickly.
Can we go back to vocational instruction? I just had a commentary to understand that. That's where, so we went from $131 to $203, and that was just 3% included in that.
I can speak to that. That does not, we charge that TRA entry only to the regular instruction, not vocational. But the reason vocational went up is that we were successful in getting additional programs approved for funding. So what we were able to do is move some of the staffing costs from the regular instructional category into vocational. So as the end result and the goal there is that we would be able to increase our funding for vocational. Vocational education does have a separate funding stream. It's not huge, but every little bit helps, and so that's why you see that increase. It was just like a reallocation of eligible expense.
And then thinking about the state averages again, so it looks like as a district we are above state average on administration and support something, and then special ed and instructional support services like technology. So those we spend more on, and then we're below average in buildings and sites, equipment, maintenance, and support issues like psychologists. Is that?
Well, I think we haven't had a chance to fully look at that one there, but that's what we talked about at the finance committee. That's one of the items in that area, so we need to take a look to see what was actually down there. But actually, you're not down, you're just less than the statewide average.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And of course, yeah, I'll have to go back and look, like, for example, when we added counselors, as far as which category they would fit into, I'd have to actually go back in the UFAR's manual and see where those are. So for the new year, 17-18, like those elementary counselors, that's a new category of expense. So we'll see in next year's audit, a year from now, we'll see how that flows through on the charts.
One of the things we talked about briefly is instructional support. I think you said that includes media people too, librarian.
Right, so that category of, what is that, instructional support? I don't have it in front of me here.
Yep, that'd be
Yeah,
paid.
that, there's a couple things. There's media specialists. What's kind of interesting there is that some districts have a really hard time finding a media specialist. So that can be one variable comparing one district to the next. But also, there are new codes for technology, and we revamped to align with exactly what the state wants us to do with coding. And so a lot of our technology purchases, if it was used for student instruction, was in that instructional support service area. So like the Chromebook purchase, for example.
Because I didn't know if some of these costs in the other districts are putting them in pupil support, because you can see you're under pupil support. So that was confusing why you're up on one and down on the other one there.
Any questions or comments? Okay, thank you, Greg.
Yep, thank you.
That moves us on to approving the audit. Is there a motion to do so, or do you have any more to present, Lori? I should ask that first.
We're ready for approval.
Okay. Is there a motion to approve? Okay, is there a second? Second. Any further discussion? Okay, all those in favor of approving the 2016-17 school district audit signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Next, we have approval of the 2017 levy to pay in 2018. Lori?
Basically, it's, as we heard at the Truth and Taxation hearing, it's just a matter of now formally approving the 17 pay 18 levy, and that is reflecting a $400,000 increase at 5.11% increase.
And I believe when we discussed that back in September, it was over 6 million originally, is that correct? Do you recall when we capped it? Or 600,000, I should say.
Yeah, it was
600,000,
something like that.
yeah, okay, so. What are your thoughts, board? Okay, is there a second to that motion? Second. Any further discussion?
I have a couple questions. So this that we're talking about right now is the 5.1 for the LTFM, basically. But in the Truth and Taxation, it sounded like, and so I'm wondering, my basic question is, what is the total change for that $100,000 homeowner? For example, it sounded like, maybe I'm not understanding this correctly either, but it sounded like the referendum piece was increasing because of inflationary and enrollment things. We were going to ask through this to increase the LTFM. Debt service was decreasing about $3 million, and then facilities maintenance and the post-employment was increasing about 2.5, and then the debt service reduction down about 100,000. So do all of those things tie in together then for that taxpayer, and they're seeing in effect a total increase of more than 5.1?
All those, numbers come into play. Yes, all those variables that were mentioned in the presentation come into play. So the grand total of all the increases and decreases in one line item or another come to the 400,000 increase. So that 5.11% is what applies to that tax impact schedule, the one schedule that looks like this. So that for a $100,000 home has an increase of $25. That is the tax impact of this levy. That's a 5.11% increase.
And so then it includes all those other pieces as well?
Includes all
Okay.
that. Yep.
Thank you. And so, so this year, they would be at, trying to think, I'm looking back at a different, so, okay, the 100,000, so they'd be at 437 this year. And if they're up 25, that means that they paid 412 last year?
Correct.
And then, maybe I'm doing my math wrong, but, so if I take 25 divided by 412, that's a little over 6%.
And what comes into play, like was mentioned earlier, like if the overall tax base changes,
okay.
then that's another variable that can affect that percentage.
Okay, thank you.
Any other discussion? Okay, we'll call the question then. All those in favor of approving 2017 pay 2018 final levy signify by saying aye. Aye. Pose same sign.
Aye.
Motion carries. Okay, our next item is our Oberly Education Association Master Agreement. Jim Quorum.
Good evening. So with this round of negotiations, we have 3 more bargaining unit contracts coming before the board. I summarized them in the update this week, but I would say that things have gone extremely well. You know, we were shooting for 6 meetings or less for each of our large bargaining units, and we've almost hit that. And we heard today at 4 o'clock from the ALEA president that without a final count, he assures us that the contract in which, well, they ratified the contract today. They voted today and ratified it, so. So the first one up is the approval of the Oberly Education Association Master Agreement for 2017-19.
Okay, motion's been made. Is there a second?
Second.
Any further discussion?
Just like to thank the negotiating team, and the same thing I said last year, it takes 2 parties to negotiate and settle and agree, and so tip of the hat to the teachers union as well, got done in a few meetings,
Yep.
big controversies, very well done.
Yeah, thank you. Okay,
And do we usually get a copy of this, or I guess I was expecting more than just the summary and the update, or is that not something that we usually?
You mean the contract?
Yeah.
I would guess that because of how late it was, I don't know. Do we normally give the entire contract? I don't think so. Yeah, I usually provide a summary.
A summary, thank you.
Yep.
any further discussion? Okay. All those in favor of approving the contract with Oberly Education Association for 2017-19 signify by saying aye. Aye. Pose same sign. Motion carries. Moving on to the next one.
Okay.
Jim?
This would be the custodians. They're affiliated with AFSCME. Again, it went fairly smoothly, and I summarized that in the board update, and so that one is ready for approval as well. They voted to approve.
Move to approve.
Okay, is there a second? Second. Okay, the motion is made and seconded. Any further discussion? Okay, all those in favor of approving the custodial contract for 2017-19 signify by saying aye. Aye. Pose same sign. Motion carries. And then now we're on to executive administration assistance.
Yeah, it's the district office executive administrative assistants, small bargaining unit, but that went well as well. And again, the summary was in the board update, and so they voted to approve.
Okay, is there a second to that motion?
Second.
Okay, we have a second to the motion. Any further discussion? Okay, all those in favor of approving the executive administrative assistance master agreement for 17-19 signify by saying aye. Aye. Pose same sign. Motion carries. I guess we're on to adjournment. Is there a motion to do so? Okay, is there a second? Okay. Meeting's adjourned.